right, so we're back here for part 2 of our conversation about resilience. Thank you again for joining us here at the Strike the Ground podcast. Pierre, and this is my wife, Jamily. So I'd figure I'll take the introduction this time. But, we thank you for joining us. These are truly conversations I think that the millennial generation that we're a part of, we really need to have. There's a lot of negative stereotypes that are associated with our generation, and for good reason. There's a lot of things that do paralyze us, and I think that talking about resilience here is something that is important for us to discuss. So, So we go kind of rolling back into what resilience means. It's that ability for you or ability for a thing to regain its shape, regain its original state after it's been bent or compressed or stretched, or the ability for each of us to overcome adversity. And so I would say, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the last couple of years that's really tested our ability to be resilient. And so, this is something that the conversation that I want to get started, mostly because, we have a lot of things that will hold us back. We have a lot of things that we can make excuses for to, say, not record our podcasts or not to take positive steps in our careers or even to start a family. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff out there in the world today that can help discourage you from achieving a lot of these things that God has for us. And I will still tie all this back to that initial command that God gave humanity, which was to be fruitful and multiply. And that's the one thing I say the enemy, that Satan, that the adversary of God wants to limit us in our ability to actually be that reflection of God to each other in our relationship, to our fellow man, and certainly to forget that each person bears that image and has the ability to reflect God in their actions based on how they sort of express themselves outwardly. Mm-hmm. And so, based on, that in particular, we want to talk about what it means to be resilient and how that plays out in our, in our daily life. And so, we each, we actually face so many challenges throughout the day. I would say there's a lot of things that can be thrown at us. Either there's like really common things or very normal challenges. And some of you may even face just the challenge of getting up on time, of actually planning your days out, planning your life out so that you can actually accomplish certain things. Really goofy, but I'd say is a really kind of, a very millennial example would be the ability for us this past weekend, being that there's a ton of rainstorms that kind of disrupted all of our plans. We finally took the time after living in this house. How long now?
For almost 5 years.
Yeah. So in this time, mind you, we've probably carried stuff over from other places we live to here. But basically, we've let our bathroom become sort of this
catch-all
for tons of stuff. And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we finally, and even we took positive steps, I would say, a couple months ago to buy these containers to organize our bathroom. But, we didn't actually do it until this past weekend. So we're not perfect. I'm not trying to sit here and tell you that I speak from some place of I live this perfect example of, reflecting God in everything that I do. I'm just letting you know that I'm a human. I'm a person. I'm normal. Like we mess up. We have shortcomings. We yell at our kids. We're not perfect parents. But also, it's good to look at your life and sort of self-examine what processes, what steps you're taking in place to actually become resilient?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing today that will help you face that challenge tomorrow? What are you doing, or what have you done in the past that helps you overcome the obstacles that you're facing today? It's very easy for us to sit here and look and say, woe is me, God, why are you against me? Or why isn't this working out for me? Or why does that person appear to have more favor than me? And so that selfish desire that we often have will limit our ability to respond to whatever that challenge is in our lives. And then we'll have a negative impact on that resilient nature that God really wants to put in us. Like he really wants us to be able to overcome those trials, those difficulties, that when we're pressed and we're crushed, that we are able to rebound and become or back into that favor, that place of blessing, that just fruitfulness that God has really intended for his people. And by his people, I mean his creation. And so I think it's really good to take a pause and look at what steps in your life that you're taking today. Are you reading the word? Have you been praying to God? Like, are you actually taking these steps of faith to actually ground yourself? And I mean, this is super basic, sounds like kind of like a platitude, but it's really important that you get that stuff down first, because when you start to saturate your daily life with being aware of God's word and how to apply his word to your daily life, the reactions that you have to these circumstances, to challenges, to adversity, to difficulty, you will have the right response.
Right.
And so, I would say that, oftentimes, we hear in church that we kind of compare ourselves in these types of circumstances to where, you're like a pressed or crushed grape that's being made into wine, or this idea that you're being broken or being pushed to the point of breaking, that God is trying to, work on your character or help you overcome this challenge or difficulty in the future. But oftentimes I think one of the things that we kind of forget about is this idea that, we often like think about the illustration of like broken bones, that when they heal, they grow back stronger and they're more resilient. But when we don't think about sometimes is like when we talk about tendons or ligaments that are torn, oftentimes when those are injured, they don't grow back stronger.
Right. They're weaker.
They are weaker. You're more prone to injury unless you go through some, very, challenging surgery to do the repair. It's often not something that you can just bounce back from. And, certainly, with your torn calf muscle we talked about in the last podcast, when it comes to these ligaments and tendons, when they're torn, they're not just something that you're going to be able to jump back into physical activity within 6 to 8 weeks.
Right.
And I think that there are times in our lives that do reflect that brokenness, that reflect that torn ligament, that torn ACL, that torn rotator cuff. And sometimes we need to understand that we've been pressed, we've been pushed so far, and maybe we weren't ready. We didn't prepare ourselves. And so we need God's healing power. We need God's intervention. We need God's ability as the great physician to bring us back to this wholeness, to bring us back to this place that we're able to be resilient again. Yeah. And maybe we need to relearn, like going through physical therapy. Maybe you need to relearn those processes again. Maybe you need to, basically do some kind of rehab so that you approach the circumstances in a different way, in a more strategic way. And I would say that this is something I'm speaking from, well, maybe not obvious. I'm speaking from experience with having some, pretty serious back issues from when I was a kid. Like I've had to learn to navigate my entire life since I was a boy until now, like how I can approach things that involve my back in a intelligent way.
Yeah.
And so that's just like one example of for you to really kind of grasp the importance of becoming resilient, because oftentimes the challenge that you face, a lot of people will say God will never give you more than you can handle. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's kind
favorite.
of
that's a favorite.
That's a pretty empty, what do you say? What do you call that?
It's not a promise. It's like a, what do you call that?
Well, cliche.
Yes, cliche.
Cliche. Thank goodness. I mean, we're not English majors over here, but I don't know if you need to be English major to think of that word. Regardless,
I'm a foreigner. Does that count? That's my excuse.
I'm a child of a foreigner, so yeah. I'll go with that too.
I don't think that applies now. I've been here for almost 30 years.
Yeah. But so a lot of people will throw cliches out there at you, and I think it's really good to know and understand that your circumstances that you face certainly are individual.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of statistics. You hear a lot of people trying to sort of pull out what applies to an entire generation or applies to a large group of people. But oftentimes what's forgotten about is that when you face this challenge or you face something difficult, it's happening to you. So it's happening to you 100% of the time when it's mm-hmm. happening. And so it's something that we can't just write off as something that's passing, or that I don't know, God, we found ourselves out of favor with God or something kind of ridiculous like that. I often think about Job and a lot of the challenges that he faced.
I'm glad you brought that up. I was thinking about Job as well.
With Job, he was in relationship with God, and God knew, because mm-hmm. God is all knowing, that even through the adversity that the devil would put him through, that ultimately Job would choose to continue to follow God and worship God. Mm-hmm. Even with all the influences in his life that were negative, that had basically were like, there's got to be something wrong with you. And Job's like, no, that's not true. Like he had to kind of work through this. And so I think that's something that's good for us to kind of look at and focus on, is that you may find people in your life that are like, well, there's got to be something wrong with you. Mm-hmm. There's got to be something wrong that you've done. Mm-hmm. That's why you don't have God's favor. That's why you don't see the blessings that I've received.
Yeah.
And I think that's really bad for people to try to compare themselves to each other spiritually, because ultimately our relationship with God is individual. And then the reflection of that relationship is something that can only come from your direct responses to whatever actions are going on between you and God in your life. Yeah.
And the thing I love most about Job, well, I don't know if I love this the most, but one of the things that really just sticks in my mind, especially in speaking about this resilience, is that he was already in so deep with God before anything was taken away. Even in all of the goodness that he had and all of the blessing that he had, that didn't cause him to I don't need to talk to God today, or I don't need to pray today, or anything like that, because had that been the case, if you are familiar with, having some moments in your life where you're farther from God, I've certainly been there, where you feel farther from the Lord, even though he's not far from you. It's you, you're prioritizing other things, or you're not reading your Bible, you're not praying as much. We tend to kind of back up if we don't need something from the Lord. And what I love most, I think, about Job, is the story about Job, is that even though he had all of that stuff, I guess, all of those blessings, all of, his family and wealth and all of these things, he was still in so deep with God, because the minute those things started going away, it wasn't like he was crawling back to God. It was, he knew who God was. He knew God's power. He knew that everything does come from him, and all that he needed was in God.
Well, not to mention that it was because of his relationship with God, his worship of God, that the devil took notice.
Yeah.
The devil took notice and said, there's got to be a way for me to have this guy turn against God. There's got to be a way. I mean, this dude went through so much loss, through financial and familial, and even went through pretty serious disease. Mm-hmm. And so, it's very easy, like for us when we face those challenges. And I would say, yeah, okay, Job seems like some supernatural character in the Bible that how could I possibly measure myself up to? But I think it's important for us to kind of demystify people in the Bible and understand that they were humans, mm-hmm. and that a lot of the challenges that we face, oftentimes they are they're things that someone else has faced to a certain extent. Whether it's exactly the same what you're facing today, maybe not, but there's certainly been things that reflect what challenges you are faced. And I know there's a lot of extreme examples people like to point out, like, take for example Daniel when he was thrown in the lion's den for worshiping God, for praying to God openly and not bowing down to social pressure of that time. It's really easy to say, oh, well, God saved him because he was thrown into a pit of lions, even though God had made him this very prominent position within the Babylonian and the Medes and Persian Empire. So like he was a really well-known dude, had a lot of enemies, had a lot of people that hated him, even though Daniel was faithful to serving God. And so it's very easy to look at that story and be like, oh, well, of course God intervened.
Yeah.
But if you think about Daniel's life, man, he was taken out of Israel as a boy and then put into the service of the Babylonian Empire right away. And so it's very easy for a lot of the Jews who you don't hear about. You don't know stories about a lot of the other ones besides Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that's their Babylonian names. But you don't hear about anyone else from that same generation. It wasn't just four kids that were brought into Babylon. It was these four guys, though. The reason why their stories are known is because they continued to remain faithful to God. And that's the sort of the challenge that, I want to bring to you as well, in that you don't have to continue the spiral that you may find yourself in. Yeah. The idea of this is the bottom of the, I've hit rock bottom and I can't possibly, I'm not worth it to God anymore. I'm not worth it to my family or whoever. I've had those thoughts, those moments in my life, some dark periods where things do seem like they're not going my way, or things are completely broken, and you just kind of wonder what's the point of all this. But if you look at the long term, if you can truly sit down and think about what God could possibly do with your life, man, he's going to do so much more than what you could think about.
Yeah.
He's going to accomplish so much more through you when you give him that opportunity, you give him the reins. And so to bring this full circle about is, so there's times where your resilience may not be enough to bring you through that tough time. It may not be enough to overcome that challenge. So you might find yourself broken. You might find yourself doubting your relationship with God, or doubting, and maybe you put your trust in people instead of God directly. And so those people let you down and they hurt you, whether it's your parents, your friends, your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever. Maybe they let you down. And so that reflection to you from them has this negative impact on how you perceive what God could possibly do with you. But man, I would never, and let's roll this back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would never have guessed that God would have blessed me with the four most beautiful children I could possibly have ever asked for. I mean, and this beautiful wife, who stuck by me through so many challenges, so many difficulties. It's just crazy to think about that through this adversity, through no effort of my own, mind you. I'm not going to even take credit for not having been broken, not having been sort of this beaten down, crushed feeling. I didn't have the resilience to bounce back and be, what God had originally intended me to be or had designed me to be. So it took me drawing near to God. It took me drawing near to his word to sort of have that restoration, to have that healing come back in. Because ultimately what we need to look at is, here's a good example, the parable, or not the parable, but the story of Jesus healing the lepers. And he tells them to go show yourselves before the priest. Basically, he's showing them to have this faith that he's going to heal them, and that when they show themselves to the priest, that they will be able to be basically brought back into community. Because when you're a leper back then, and even in some societies today, or cultures today, when you're a leper, you're excised from the community. You're basically isolated, and so it's sort of this. I won't say a death sentence, but it certainly is when you have
social death sentence.
Yeah, I mean, you have this. You're cut off from community. Yeah. When you're cut off from community, man, it's difficult for you to find people who aren't just like you, especially in the circumstance, that aren't as miserable as you. Mm-hmm. Like when you're around people that are encouraging, or you're around people that, and I would say everyone kind of runs through different stages of when things are going well and things are challenging. And so when you have those opposing moments in your life, you may find yourself the person who's able to reach out and encourage someone else, just like they're able to reach out and encourage you when you're finding that moment of brokenness. Mm-hmm. And so with those lepers, Jesus gave them this ability to be healed of their leprosy, but so they're cured of their disease. The priest would examine them to make sure that they are no longer lepers, and so they can come back in a community. But then the one that came back and praised him, the one that came back and worshiped him, he said that you've been made whole. Yeah. And so there's this difference of, okay, they were healed, but they probably still had their scars. They probably still had evidence that they were lepers at some point. But this one leper that returned, who was made whole, means that he was restored back to this place, this promise that God had initially designed him for. And so that also means that we have this same access. We have this same ability to be restored, to be brought back into the design that God. So not just to have our wounds healed, or not just to have the brokenness in our lives healed, but actually to achieve wholeness, to achieve, the Hebrew word shalom, this wholeness that is sort of this glimpse, this preview of what man's relationship was intended to be with God directly before the fall, before Adam and Eve fell. So it's something that we can, I would say, look to and understand that you have access to the same promises, whether you're the lepers that want to be healed. God can touch you that way and heal you, and you'll still have your wounds and your scars, or you can be made whole by receiving his healing and then drawing near to him, drawing near so that you read the word, you worship him, that Jesus is someone that's real, that actively represented and reflected in your life. Yeah,
it's beautiful. I love that. And that really is the key, right? It's key to, it's kind of like the secret weapon to your life is when you are drawing near to Christ and you are aligning yourself with all of the things that he wants you to accomplish. Not for us, not the accomplishments that we necessarily want, but the things that he wants to see here on earth. So it's this kind of aligning ourselves with his spirit, and then an open heaven over our lives for his glory and for his purpose. And yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
So I just want to leave you encouraged. Hopefully, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll have, contact email in the description below. We'll also, we encourage you to engage in discussion about what things that you could do in your life to, directly develop resilience, maybe what challenges you have faced. Feel free. We're here to talk to you, and we want to share this message because it's important. We feel that God is, God wants to talk to you, and He's using our voices to communicate this message. Certainly, this love that He has that is available for each of us. So, appreciate you hanging out with us this long. And,
thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. All right.